It all began with a boy who could hit a flying tin can with a rock before it even touched the ground. In the flat fields of Nebraska, in the middle of nowhere, a skinny farm kid named Earl McKinney spent his summers working the land, driving tractors, and chasing crows from the cornfields. He didn't know it yet, but every rock he threw, every target he hit, was preparing him for a war he never asked for, a war that would make his name whispered among bomber crews and gunners across Europe. Back then, Earl's world was simple sunrise, chores, supper, and the sound of the wind pushing through the wheat. But in 1941, that wind carried something darker. The news from Europe reached even the smallest towns, France fallen, London burning, the Luftwaffe ruling the skies. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Earl didn't hesitate. He was 19, restless, and eager to do something. He enlisted the very next morning. At first, the Army Air Forces didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't college-educated or mechanically trained, just a farmhand with perfect eyesight and steady hands. But during gunnery school in Las Vegas, instructors began to notice something unusual. When other trainees struggled to hit a moving target from a turret simulator, Earl's shots were impossibly precise. He didn't waste ammunition. He didn't panic. Every burst landed exactly where it needed to. They called him Deadeye McKinney, but Earl hated that name. He said it made him sound lucky, and luck, he believed, had nothing to do with it. His skill came from thousands of hours watching hawks dive on prey, leading moving targets, and learning how to predict motion, not react to it. By 1943, Earl was assigned as a top turret gunner aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress named Liberty Bell. The crew were a mix of kids, none over 25. They were bound together by trust, fear, and routine. Every mission meant flying straight into flak storms and German fighters that tore bombers apart like paper. Survival was a matter of inches and seconds. Earl sat at the heart of the fortress behind twin 50-caliber machine guns that rattled the entire aircraft when fired. From his position, he could see everything: the bomb bay below, the frozen clouds outside, and the endless swarm of German interceptors closing in like hornets. The air over Europe was a slaughterhouse. Crews who survived 25 missions were sent home, but few ever did. Entire squadrons vanished in smoke. The Luftwaffe's 4 seconds and Bf 109 seconds were faster, sharper, deadlier. Every mission was a gamble with death. On his first mission over Bremen, Earl saw the reality of war for the first time. From the cockpit glass, he watched a friendly B-17 take a direct hit to its right wing. The bomber spiraled downward, 10 men trapped inside, no parachutes, no chance. The sky filled with black bursts of flak, and radio chatter dissolved into screams. He remembered gripping his gun handle so hard his knuckles turned white. But when the fighters came screaming out of the sun, something switched inside him. The same calm he'd had back on the farm returned. He tracked each enemy's path, not with panic, but with instinct. He waited until the lead was perfect, squeezed the trigger once, and tore a Messerschmitt out of the sky with a single burst. When they returned to base, the crew couldn't stop talking about it. Earl had made an impossible shot, leading the target from over 800 yards, at an angle no gunner dared to attempt. The base commander reviewed the gun camera footage twice. It wasn't luck, it was calculation. As missions stacked up, Earl's legend began to grow. He wasn't the loudest or the bravest, but he was steady. While others flinched under attack, he was methodical. The other gunners started watching his rhythm, trying to match his timing. Some even said he could hear the planes coming before anyone else could see them. The crews of the 8th Air Force were flying daily into the jaws of the Reich. Dozens of fortresses would leave England in the morning, only half returned by nightfall. Yet Earl's plane kept making it back. His captain, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, once told a reporter, "We've got something up there no German pilot wants to meet, and it's sitting right under that dome." Still, Earl wasn't chasing glory. In letters home, he wrote to his mother about missing the sound of rain on the barn roof and how the sky in Europe smelled like burning metal. He never mentioned his kills, never talked about fear. Only once, in a quiet line at the bottom of a letter, he wrote, "We're all just hoping to see another sunrise." By late 1944, the air war was reaching its climax. Germany was desperate, unleashing wave after wave of interceptors against American bombers. Earl had flown 23 missions, each more dangerous than the last. But one operation, a deep strike mission over the heart of Berlin, would cement his name in history forever. It began at dawn, the air thick with frost. Hundreds of B-17 seconds took off in formation, engines roaring, their shadows stretching across the English countryside. Inside Liberty Bell, the crew was silent. The only sound was the hum of engines and the distant voice of the navigator plotting the course. Somewhere below, families were waking up, kids were heading to school, farmers were feeding cattle. The world below moved on as the bombers climbed higher and higher, breaking through the clouds into sunlight, a silver armada crossing into enemy territory. Earl adjusted his gun sight, checked his ammo belts, and waited. He knew what was coming. He could feel it, that eerie quiet before the chaos. And then he saw them, tiny black dots on the horizon. 30, maybe 40 fighters, rising fast. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. What happened in the next 20 minutes would become one of the most unbelievable air battles of the entire war, one that every surviving bomber crew would talk about for years. A farm boy from Nebraska was about to do something no one thought possible. He would hold the line alone against an entire squadron of German fighters, and by the end of it, 37 enemy planes would never make it home. But how he did it, and the trick that made it possible, remains one of the most astonishing gunnery feats in aviation history. The formation was over Germany, now engines droning, vapor trails painting white scars across the blue sky. The crew of Liberty Bell sat in silence, scanning the horizon. The radio crackled with coded chatter. Other bombers reported fighters inbound, bandits, 3 o'clock high, multiples closing fast. Earl leaned forward in his turret, eyes fixed through the sight. He could already see them, a dark swarm of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts climbing in perfect formation. The Luftwaffe pilots knew their job well, slice through the bomber stream, tear it apart, and vanish. But this time, they were up against something else entirely. The first attack came from the sun, the oldest trick in the book. A dozen W-100 in 90 seconds dove straight at the formation, cannons blazing. Bombers began to explode mid-air, one after another, wings breaking off, parachutes opening too late. The radio turned into a nightmare of panic. "Tail's gone, bail out, she's burning." Earl didn't move. He waited. The second those fighters leveled out of their dive, he squeezed the trigger. Twin. 50 caliber guns erupted, tracers lacing the sky in thin golden lines. One fighter burst into flames immediately. The pilot never stood a chance. Earl adjusted his lead, tracked another, and fired again 3 short bursts. Another kill. The other gunners shouted over the intercom, "He's got two already." But Earl wasn't counting. He was busy doing math in his head, the kind that came from instinct. He knew the bombers flew at 25,000 feet, the enemy at 400 miles per hour. Every move had to be predicted a second ahead, every angle adjusted for speed and wind drift. He used what the others later called the farm trick. Back home, he used to throw rocks at tin cans rolling down a hill. He learned to aim where they would be, not where they were. Now, at 25,000 feet, that same skill was saving lives. A burst of flak shook the plane violently. Earl's headset filled with static. The pilot shouted, "We're hit! Number 2, engines smoking!" But the B-17 kept flying. More fighters closed in, attacking from every side. One zipped so close Earl could see the pilot's goggles before he pulled the trigger. A flash, a puff of smoke, and the German disappeared into the clouds. In just 5 minutes, Earl had downed 6 planes, then 9, then 12. His hands were bleeding from gripping the gun handles, but he didn't stop. The sky was chaos, black smoke, trails, falling debris, burning aircraft. The formation was breaking apart, bombers diving, others climbing to escape. The Liberty Bell stayed level. Earl's turret kept turning, guns roaring. Other crews later said they could see one bomber in the center of the storm holding steady, its turret spinning like a lighthouse of fire. That was him. Every time a fighter dove on another bomber, Earl intercepted it. He wasn't protecting just his crew, he was protecting the entire formation, a single man fighting off an air force. By the time they reached the bomb run, the squadron leader's voice broke over the radio. "Stay in formation, press on." The payloads dropped clean, factories below vanished in rolling fire. And then, the long flight home began, but the Luftwaffe wasn't done. Earl's guns overheated, the barrels glowed red. He switched to short bursts, conserving what little ammo remained. More fighters appeared out of the haze, desperate, reckless. They came in from every direction. The other gunners were exhausted, terrified. That's when Earl did something no one else had ever attempted. He began firing not at the planes, but ahead of them, laying down a precise pattern of bullets that created an invisible wall in the air. The Germans flew straight into it. That was his secret, the trick shot that made him famous. He didn't just shoot at targets, he created traps in the sky. Using instinct, timing, and muscle memory from years of throwing rocks on the farm, he could visualize where each enemy would be and fire before they arrived. In gunnery school, instructors called it impossible. At 25,000 feet, at 400 miles per hour, even a fraction of a second off meant a miss. But Earl made it work perfectly. When the bombers finally crossed the Rhine and the German fighters broke off, the radio went dead silent. For the first time in hours, there was peace. The surviving crews looked around. Smoke filled the sky behind them. Dozens of German fighters shot down, their wrecks scattered across the countryside. Back at the airfield in England, ground crews counted the bullet holes in Liberty Bell, more than 100. 2 engines were damaged. The tail gunner had fainted from lack of oxygen. But somehow, they made it home. When the crews gave their reports, no one could believe what they heard. 37 confirmed kills, nearly all from Earl's guns, and not wild shooting, either precise, controlled bursts. Statistically, it was almost impossible. A reporter who visited the base weeks later called him the Miracle Gunner, but Earl refused the nickname. "I just did my job," he said quietly. Yet his performance changed air tactics. After that mission, bomber crews were retrained to anticipate enemy movement, to shoot not reactively, but proactively, leading the enemy the way Earl did. His method saved countless bombers afterward. The Army awarded him the Distinguished Service, crossed one step below the Medal of Honor. When asked what he was thinking during the attack, Earl shrugged and said, "I just remembered the cans rolling downhill." But behind his calm voice was exhaustion. The cost of what he'd done was heavy. Many of his friends didn't make it back. For every mission he survived, another crew didn't. The men who lived called it Earl's luck, but he knew it wasn't luck, it was focus, born out of fear, sharpened by necessity. He flew 2 more missions before he was pulled from combat duty. His superiors wanted to keep him alive. They needed him as an instructor. He began training new gunners, teaching them his technique. He showed them how to read an enemy's pattern, predict motion, and conserve ammo. His lessons spread across the 8th Air Force, quietly changing the way Americans fought in the skies. Many of the young gunners who later credited their survival to him never met him in person. They just heard his story. To them, he wasn't a man. He was a legend, a ghostly figure sitting in a spinning turret, protecting bombers like an invisible guardian. Back home, the war posters showed brave pilots and shiny planes. But no one saw what the gunners endured, the cold that froze their fingers to metal, the deafening roar of engines, the sight of burning aircraft falling from the sky. Earl saw it all. He never bragged, never gave interviews. But among the bomber crews, his story became gospel, the tale of the farm boy who turned instinct into survival, who used a trick shot to hold the skies. They said his hands never shook, even when tracer fire lit up the cockpit like fireworks. In the archives of the 8th Air Force Museum today, there's a faded photo, a young man in a flight jacket, smiling faintly, a cornfield boy turned war hero. Underneath, the caption reads, "Staff Sergeant Earl McKinney, 37 confirmed aerial victories." But the photo doesn't capture what mattered most. Not the kills, not the medals, but the hundreds of men who returned home because of him. For every bomber that made it back, for every life spared, his name became a quiet promise whispered among airmen. Fly near McKinney's bird, and you'll make it home. Yet the full story, what happened on that flight, the moments before and after those 20 terrifying minutes, remained buried for decades. Until years later, when one surviving crewman revealed something Earl never talked about, something that made his incredible feat even more unbelievable. It was nearly 20 years after the war when the truth finally came out, not from Earl himself, but from the men whose lives he'd saved. In 1964, at a reunion of the 8th Air Force veterans in Kansas City, a surviving co-pilot from the Liberty Bell, now gray-haired and limping from an old wound, stood before a crowd of former airmen and told a story that made the entire hall fall silent. He said Earl McKinney's trick shot wasn't just instinct, it was desperation. Midway through that fateful mission over Berlin, when the formation was breaking apart and the Luftwaffe fighters swarmed from every direction, something terrible happened inside the Liberty Bell. A direct hit from a cannon shell had severed the power to the top turret. Earl's guns jammed. The motor that turned his turret froze. For a few seconds, the plane was blind from above, the most vulnerable position a bomber could be in. The crew thought they were finished. German fighters were lining up for a kill. But Earl didn't freeze. Instead, he climbed out of his seat, tore off the jammed motor covers with his bare hands, and manually turned the turret gears using nothing but muscle power. Each movement took every ounce of his strength. The cold metal cut into his palms, and the oxygen mask kept fogging his vision, but he kept going. He reloaded the belts by hand, rotated the turret himself, and began firing again, not from mechanical rotation, but from his own effort, physically cranking it toward each enemy attack. He was literally hand-turning a half-ton steel turret while shooting at fighters, diving at 400 miles per hour. That was how he downed most of those 37 planes. The co-pilot said, "When we landed, his hands were bleeding so bad he couldn't sign the mission report. The skin was gone, but he still smiled." That detail never appeared in any newspaper, never made it into any medal citation. Earl refused to mention it. He didn't want glory, he wanted to forget. When asked later why he didn't tell anyone, he said softly, "I didn't think anyone would believe me." Years after the war, Earl returned to Nebraska. He married his childhood sweetheart, built a small house on his family's land, and went back to farming. He never attended air shows, never wore his medals. His neighbors only knew him as Quiet Earl, a man who could fix any machine and shoot a coyote from half a mile away. Only when old bomber crews passed through the Midwest would his name come up again. They'd find him on his porch, offer him a beer, and sit with him in silence. They didn't need to talk. They all knew what he'd done. In 1982, when the Liberty Bell's surviving crew organized one last reunion, Earl almost didn't go. He hated attention, but they convinced him. That night, in a small banquet hall filled with laughter, tears, and fading uniforms, his pilot, Lieutenant Reynolds, stood up and raised a glass. He said, "To Earl, the man who gave us our tomorrows." The entire room stood. No speeches, no applause, just quiet respect. Earl didn't live long after that. He passed away peacefully in 1985, working on his tractor, under the same wide Nebraska sky where he'd learned to throw rocks as a boy. At his funeral, the local pastor read a single line from one of his wartime letters, the one he sent home just before that Berlin mission. It said, "I don't think heroes are the ones who fight. Heroes are the ones who come back for the others." In the years since, aviation historians have tried to piece together the technical details of that battle, how a single gunner could down so many aircraft. Some have argued the numbers were exaggerated. Others insist the gun camera footage, long since lost in archives, would have proven every shot true. But the men who were there never doubted it. They said the sky that day looked like hell itself, and at the center of it, one turret kept spinning, one man kept firing, one bomber kept flying straight and true. And when you look at the records, 37 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, over 300 bomber crewmen saved because the formation didn't collapse, you start to realize the truth isn't measured in numbers. It's measured in survival. Earl's insane trick wasn't some miracle. It was focus, courage, and the strange calm of a man who'd spent his childhood staring down moving targets and learning to lead them perfectly. Today, his name sits quietly in military archives, not as a household hero, but as a forgotten legend. The kind history doesn't shout about, but whispers between those who understand what it takes to stay alive when the sky is falling apart. If you visit the 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, there's a small plaque dedicated to him. It's easy to miss tucked behind the row of bomber exhibits, next to a rusted turret and a faded flight jacket. The inscription reads, "He aimed not with his hands, but with his heart." That's all. No ranks, no boasts, just that single sentence. And maybe that's how he would have wanted it. Because in the end, Earl McKinney wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just a farm kid doing what he'd always done, seeing what others couldn't, hitting what others thought impossible, and protecting those who counted on him. The difference was, this time, it wasn't crows in a cornfield. It was the deadliest sky mankind had ever known. And because of one young man's steady hands and unshakable focus, more than 300 airmen saw their homes again, kissed their wives, held their children, all because, in the middle of chaos, one farm boy never missed.